Good morning.
Morning.
So as you know, we're continuing our sermon series, Faith on Broadway, and today the musical we'll be talking about is South Pacific. Who here has seen South Pacific before? So a few of us, quite a few of us actually. So I had never seen South Pacific till I watched half of it before I left for Guatemala, and then I watched the second half when I got back. So I do know what happens now, but I just couldn't watch the whole thing before I left because we're kind of busy with going and doing that. But I loved it. It was really great. But for those who have seen it, you'll know this. But for those who haven't seen it, it deals with issues of race and prejudice and acceptance. And so I just want to give a brief overview, maybe remind some of us who's been a while since we've seen it, or for those who haven't seen it, just to kind of catch us up and get us all on the same page. So the first production of South Pacific was April 7th, 1949, and this was just 4 years after the end of the Pacific conflict that the story's kind of telling about. So this is fresh on people's minds. And the book is the musical is based on a book called The Tales of South Pacific, and it begins with Lieutenant Joseph Cable, and he lands on Pacific Island where the Navy is stationed. And as they're coming down and they're landing, you meet another character. Lieutenant Joseph Cable is right there. So that is from the movie that was made in 1958. And so as he lands, he's on this island. He meets another character, Luther Billis. So that is that guy. And the one that he's trying to do is get to this island called Bali High. They're not really doing a whole lot on this island. They're kind of just like hanging out. But he's trying to get to this island. However, you have to be an officer to be able to go to this island. So Luther Billis kind of sees Joseph Cable as his opportunity to go with an officer to this the island called Bali High. So once Lieutenant Cable lands, we learn that he's looking for another character, this Frenchman named Emile Debec. And so that's the next picture there. Then they're looking for him because he's going on this recon scouting mission to kind of figure out where the Japanese are on this other island. And so he has been there for years and years and years, and he would kind of know the area the best. And so they're looking for him and are trying to convince him to go on this mission with the Americans to go see the Japanese there. And so they are trying to convince him to do this. And like I said, Lieutenant Cable has been entrusted with this mission to try to help the Americans win the war. And so when they finished, we are introduced to another character named Nellie Forbush, and so she's pictured there. She's a nurse, and she's dating the Frenchman, Debec. And so the Navy brings her in to talk to her about, hey, can you get us some information on this guy? Since you're dating him, that would be helpful to us, that sort of thing. And so she kind of agrees, and they finally bring Debec in and talk to him and try to do this, play up this mission like this is a really great opportunity for you. It's really awesome. Maybe you guys have been in a work situation where someone said the exact same thing to you. We really want you to do this. And so Debec's in love with Nellie, so of course he says, I'm not even American, so I'll pass. Like, I don't need to go on this mission with you. And so at that point, it's not going to happen right away, so Lieutenant Cable goes to Bali High, and this is where Luther Billis goes with him. He finally has this opportunity to go and see what's kind of over there. And as they're on the island, you meet another character, Layette, which is the next picture. She's on the left, and her mother, Bloody Mary, is on the right. And Lieutenant Joseph Cable falls in love with her. And the mother, Bloody Mary, is super excited. As she says in the movie version I watched, you're going to be my son-in-law. So she's like super excited that Lieutenant Cable has fallen in love with her daughter. They're talking, but actually Joseph Cable decides that he can't bring himself to marry her because of the color of her skin and what people back home would be thinking of him. And so he leaves. And at that same time, Nellie and Emile are having dinner, and they're talking about getting married, and they're in love, and it's wonderful, and it's great. And you find out that Emile was actually married before to a Polynesian woman, and so he's talking about marriage, so it might be a good idea to introduce this girl to his children, which I don't know why he wouldn't have done this before, but he doesn't. They date for, I feel like it's a significant amount of time to not introduce this girl you like to your children. Anyway, so he finally introduces her to his children, and she realizes that he was married to a Polynesian woman and they're mixed race, and she can't do it, and so she leaves. Nellie, like Joe Cable, can't bring herself to marry Emil for much the same reason, and again, she leaves. So Emil's heartbroken, and so he goes back to the Navy captain and says, I don't have anything else to live for, which my wife and I were sitting watching the movie, and I was like, you have 2 kids. But anyway, like he says he doesn't have anything else to live for. I don't know. They're trying to like really push this storyline. So I think he has kids. I mean, he does have kids, 2 kids that I think is, they're small children. He has a lot to live for. Anyway, Nellie leaves. He has nothing to live for. And so he says, I will go with Lieutenant Cable to go on this mission. And so they go off on this mission. But before they leave, there's this conversation that happens where Lieutenant Cable is talking to Emil, and he basically says, if I ever get off this island, or if I ever get out of this war, I'm going to stay on this island because everything I love is here. So you kind of see this movement for him where he's going to marry Layette, and he's going to stay in the Pacific. But as it goes on, they land. Lieutenant Joseph Cable is killed in action, and they soon learn about that, and they radio back to let them know. And Nellie finds out, and Layette comes with her mother, Bloody Mary, and says she won't marry anyone else. She'll only marry Joseph Cable, and then she has to inform her that that Lieutenant Cable has died. And then you're still not sure if Emil's going to make it back alive. And during that moment, Nellie goes and actually is at Emil's house with his children, and is playing with them and kind of getting to know them. And that's kind of the end, close to the end of the musical, because as she's playing with them and getting to know them, Emil is singing Up Around the Corner, and they close out the song there. And so it kind of ends with Emil coming back. You have the assumption that Nellie and Emil get married and stay in the Pacific Island, and all of that. So, as we heard in the words of gathering, in the opening prayer, there's this moment in South Pacific that Nellie believes that she can't marry Emil, that it just won't work because they're too different. And we'll sing that song a little bit later and talk more about that in a little bit. Because she's been taught, carefully taught, as they say, that you can't marry someone who has a different color skin as you do. She can't possibly see herself with someone who has mixed-race children, and she can't bring herself to marry him. She believes you're born with this idea that 2 races don't go together, and there's nothing she can do to change that. Later, she has a conversation with Lieutenant Cable, because remember, he's kind of going through the same type of process of crisis of how do I reconcile these 2 things. But he believes that that's not born in you, but in fact, you're carefully taught that from a very young age, and that's when he breaks into song about the song Carefully Taught. And what Joe Cable is realizing in that moment is you aren't born that way, but again, you're carefully taught that from a very, very young age. And he may have been carefully taught to hate, which is kind of what he's thinking about, but I think in that moment he's realizing he can also be carefully taught to love others. He can be carefully taught to think differently. And he can be carefully taught not to fear and to love all people. So as Lieutenant Cable is singing the song, we see this movement away from kind of this hate and prejudice and more towards a movement toward acceptance, which we see by the end of the movie really with both characters. And it's after this song that not only Lieutenant Cable decides that he loves Layette and wants to marry her, but this is also where Nellie decides to be with Emil's children, even while he's away, and then obviously he comes back and they get married, and it's a happy ending to the story. So, like the musical South Pacific, we heard some scriptures read this morning about how we might think differently, how we might love instead of hate, and how everything we need is actually right in front of us, has been in front of us the whole time. We can when we can carefully lean into Jesus, hear and allow him to teach us a new way to love, a new way to accept others, and a new way to work for peace in the world. So, Scripture today began in Luke 17, verse 20, and it says this: The Pharisees asked Jesus, when God's kingdom was coming. And he replies, God's kingdom isn't coming with signs that are easily noticed. Nor will people say, look, here it is, or there it is. Don't you see? God's kingdom is already among you. And so as I was preparing for this, I found it really interesting. Some scholars actually translate the God's kingdom is already among you by saying God's kingdom is already within you. And so I feel like that kind of gives a new way to really think about what Jesus is actually saying to them. I just love that way of thinking about that passage. And it's this idea that Jesus is telling them, you don't need some great sign or thunder or crazy thing that's going to happen, or you don't need to believe this or believe that. You already have everything that you need, that God's kingdom is already within you. So the Pharisees' questions we see here revolve around the question of when. When's God's kingdom coming? When is it? But the disciples are really asking a different question. We see that here in verse 22, but they're asking where. So it says in verse 22, Then Jesus said to the disciples, the time will come when you will long to see one of the days of the human one, and you won't see it. People will say to you, look there, or look here. Don't leave or go chasing after them. The human one will appear on his day in the same way that a flash of lightning lights up the sky from one end to the other. So again here, like the Pharisees, Jesus is telling his disciples that it's going to be different than you think, than you've been raised or carefully taught. The Pharisees wanted to know when, and Jesus said that God's kingdom is already here. And then the disciples, they wanted to know where, and Jesus is quick to tell them that it's going to be quick, sudden, and you might miss it, like a bolt of lightning. Be careful, lean in. You don't want to miss it. And then in verse 31, Jesus continues. It says, on that day, those on the roof whose possessions are in the house shouldn't come down to grab them. Likewise, those in the field shouldn't turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever tries to preserve their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life will preserve it. I tell you, on that night, two people will be in the same bed. One will be taken and the other left. Two women will be grinding grain together. One will be taken and the other left. So Jesus here references Lot's wife, who, just as a reminder, that was, they fled Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot's wife turns around when they said not to turn around, and she turns into a pillar of salt, which is an interesting image to have in one's head. But I think the purpose of what Jesus is saying here is a lot of times we can look back on something the way that it used to be and think and long to go back to that space. But the reality is we can't go back to the way things used to be. We need to continue to move on forward. And that's when Jesus says that you must lose your life to preserve it. Because when we see a new way to live, we'll see more love and more grace and more peace. We'll see more of who Jesus is and who Jesus calls us to be. And when this happens, we won't want to go back. And so Jesus kind of is bookending these two ideas in this passage. One, that God's kingdom is already within you. And two, whoever tries to preserve their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life will preserve it. So, how does this idea of theater and theology come together? How does this idea of South Pacific and Nellie and Emil and all these characters here meet with what kind of Jesus is talking to not only his disciples, but he's talking to these Pharisees? And again, these Pharisees weren't like Jesus' best pal. Like, they didn't really like Jesus a whole lot. So how do these two things merge here? So much like when Nellie saw Emil's children, and she didn't see a way for her to be with Emil, this is like the Pharisees asking Jesus when God's kingdom is coming. They thought it was this far-off date into the future, but in reality, God's kingdom was already present. They had everything they needed already within them. In the same way, Nellie thought this is just something that she was born into. But by the end of South Pacific, we see a change. She finds herself able to love not just Emil, but his children in a completely new way, something that was already within her. She didn't have to live into the culture of hate of the other or prejudice of those who look different. And in fact, she could accept all people. It was within Nellie, again, all along. In much the same way that Jesus tells the Pharisees that it's not about when God's kingdom will come, but that it's already here again. It's within you and it's within me. For us, it can be easy to hear or watch or however you partake in the news and see all the things going on around us and the world and kind of throw up our hands like we can't do anything. I don't know if you know this, but we live in a 24-hour news cycle, and it can be a bit depressing at times. We hear one bad story after another after another. It can be easy to think there isn't anything we can do. But what Jesus teaches us from this passage is that we can do something. God's kingdom is already among us. Again, it's within us. What do we mean by God's kingdom? It's the hope and the peace and the love of God residing in you and residing in me. It's because of this that we can enact hope and peace in a world that is in desperate need of that. Like I said before, this past week I'd never seen South Pacific before. The only time I'd heard of South Pacific was my wife was when she was in 7th grade. She went to Hawaii, and so it was kind of filmed in that area. Her grandma wanted to watch the movie, and so there's a Talkie Talkie Boy song that they do, and so that was the only reference to the movie I'd ever seen, or she would do this, and I'm like, I don't know what that's from, and she's like, it's from South Pacific, we can watch it now. I was like, great. So that was the only reference before I had ever seen the movie of what that was, so it was out of context, and the song was fine, it was great. But yeah, so after watching it, I found that even though this musical was a huge hit, which is why we're doing it in 2019, that it was hit with some issues when it went on a national tour. There were states who didn't love the song Carefully Taught, and so they actually put forth legislation to try to ban it from being played. And especially from the words in this song where it says, "You've got to be carefully taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught." So just as a point of reference, in our own country, in the midst of when this comes out, we're in the midst of segregation, and so people who were pro-segregation did not love that they were kind of trying to change that, and kind of put this practice under a microscope and thought maybe we shouldn't segregate people, maybe we should all be, together. And so, again, we're at it comes out in 1949, and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement was 1954, so we're right on the cusp of all of these changes and all of these things happening. And because this song was so difficult for people in their communities, they tried to stipulate that you can do this musical, that's fine, but you cannot play, this scene has to be cut out. The scene where they sing the song can't be played. But Rodgers and Hammerstein insisted that the song, if the song wasn't going to be played, that's fine, but then we won't play the entire thing. So then we'll just skip your city and move on to the next one. And it really became, which I found really interesting, this really became like an anthem for the whole civil rights movement. And this, again, goes back to the words of Jesus that he says in this passage that we read today. We have to lose our life. And this isn't about physically dying, but it's about dying to old ways of thinking, about the world, about race, what we think of other people, who's accepted and who isn't. Jesus is calling you and me to die to those old ways that only preserve us and our way instead of preserving all people, because the story of Jesus is just that, available to all people. When you lose the old ways, you'll see an even more life-giving and transformational way to live. You'll see the gospel, and you'll see the good news. By doing this, we can move towards more hope and joy and peace and love, the kind that only comes from Jesus. It comes from knowing that you already have everything you need within God's kingdom, which is already inside each of us. And so, as many of you know, I just got back from Guatemala last Sunday, so I missed Sunday morning, but I was here by about 3 o'clock because I got up at 2:30 in the morning. It was great. And I'm not going to tell a lot about what we did necessarily there. A lot of you know we build stoves, and it was a really great experience. We have Mission Sunday next week, so I hope you come back to hear stories from a lot of our youth and adults who were on that trip. But I do want to tell one thing we did. So we built stoves, but Transformational Journeys does a really good job with teaching us about cultural things of Guatemala. So we learned a lot. Like I learned how to make tortillas and dye fabrics. And we got in on Friday, late Friday. We had a little day on Saturday, and then Sunday we did basically a cultural learning day from about 8:30 to 3:30 in the afternoon, where we went around and learned the history of San Lucas and learned all of these things. And one of the things that I learned when I was in college in preparation for a mission trip, one of my professors that was leading the group always said, now, this is going to be different than I was in Northeast Ohio at the time. This is going to be different than Northeast Ohio. We're going to go to this space. And when something odd to you happens, don't say, that's weird. Don't do that. He said, say, that's interesting. I wonder why they do it that way. And so that's something that I've instilled in our youth here and even the youth that I led. So Guatemala, I don't know if you know this, is a little different than Buffalo Grove. And so one of the things is preparing them, I would tell them, I said, when something happens, when we're running late or they're not on time or they do something that you think, I could do this better, don't say that. Just say, that's interesting. I wonder why they do it that way. And it kind of became a joke on the trip. But I remember sitting down with Joanna Amaral, and she was talking to me. It was about the 7th evening. We were having dinner or whatever. And she just said how she really enjoyed that phrase. She goes, I know a lot of the kids like joke around about it, and it's fine. I go, but it really does help me, she was talking about her personal experience, to like think about why they do it that way. And I think oftentimes it's easy for us to think we have all the best answers. But I think at least when we were in Guatemala, when I would say, that's interesting, I wonder why they do it that way when I'm cutting cinder block with a machete and a hammer, I think maybe there's a better way. But the reality is, for what they have there, that is literally the best way. And I think sometimes when we say, that's interesting, I wonder why they do it that way, it allows us to pause and to think, and maybe there are times that we saw where their way was better than our way to do it. And they have a better experience and kind of know how to do that. But that kind of allows us to pause and think about that. So stories like this can help us see other people. It sees other cultures. It sees other groups that are different. And the difference isn't synonymous with bad. It's just that. It's just different. And we learn by seeing something or someone that is different. You know, you see something like, wow, that's different. I've never seen it done that way. You learn from that. We don't oftentimes learn from seeing the same thing over and over and over again. And it's through these differences that we can begin to see each and every person is made in the image of God. All races are accepted. All people are accepted. Everyone means just that. It means everyone. Everyone is loved and accepted and has an equal spot at the table. This is what God's kingdom is. The one the Pharisees and the disciples were asking about, the one that is within you and me. May we, Kingswood Church, live out God's love and hope and joy and peace today. How will you look to the kingdom inside of you and work for more love and peace in our community? How will you carefully teach God's love to serve others and to build sacred community this week by working for the acceptance of all people in all communities? We do this by leaning into God's kingdom that is already within us, and we can carefully be taught to love all, to serve all, and to welcome all. Amen. Holy, loving God, we thank you today, and we're reminded again today of your kingdom that's already within us. And even though our world can at times teach us to hate and be afraid, we know that you call us to love and push for more peace and joy and hope. So may we, Kingswood Church, go from this place and push for just that. More of God's kingdom, more of God's hope and peace and love that is already within us. Amen.
Amen.